Almost everybody knows about the horrendous suffering of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. But did you know that African Germans were targeted too? These amazing historians are going to tell us everything about the Afro-German suffering during the Holocaust.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the origins of Afro-Germans in Germany. So in the 1880s, Southwest Africa was colonized by Germany, and it kind of resulted in the Herero genocide. So the Germans ruled over the colony of Southwest Africa, which was populated by various groups, and these groups were the Damara, the Nama, and the Herero, and they were cattle herding people. And so one of the biggest gripes the Herero had with Germany is because they didn't want a railway going through their land. So they decided to resist the Germans, and that's when Germany started getting more and more aggressive. And by a quote by General Lothar von Trotha, who was in charge of slaughtering all these people, he said a humane war cannot be waged against those who are not human. So you can already have a sense that he's dehumanizing a population because of their race, and he would go through many inhumane actions to hurt them. And so in the end, 65,000 Herero died, 80% of the Herero population, 10,000 Nama died, and 50% of the Nama population. And the genocide was mainly through starvation and poisoning, and also physical abuse. So until the Nazis came to power, so we're in Germany now, there were still black people in Germany. There were usually entertainers, musicians. Some of them came there to study, and people said that they faced far less discrimination in Germany than they did in their home countries, like America. So we don't know how many Afro-Germans there were in Germany because they didn't really poll residents, and they didn't have a census to count as many until after World War II. So there's no definitive number how many black people there were in Germany and how many were affected during the Holocaust. And there are some writers who came to Germany who said that they've experienced far less discrimination, and those are Mary Church Terrell and W.E.B. Du Bois, and they both said that, and that's why a lot of Afro-Germans, or currently Afro-Germans, came to Germany, Afro-Europeans as a whole, because they felt that Germany was one of the best places to be, and that's why there was a population of them there.
After the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the Allies occupied the Rhineland with French colonial soldiers, some of whom were black. While occupying the Rhineland, many French soldiers had children with the women in the area, leading to the birth of a group of between 600 and 800 mixed-race children, which came to be known as the Rhineland Bastards. Before and after World War I, Germany was known as a place for the arts and academic studies, and people from all over the world, including Africa, came to the country as students, artisans, entertainers, and soldiers. There were probably thousands of people of African descent living in Germany at the time. However, there is no way of knowing the exact number because no formal census was ever taken, and estimates have varied wildly. People of African descent can be found all across Germany and were mainly comprised of men from Germany's former African colonies. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, took a survey of Afro-Europeans in the German-controlled portion of Europe in 1942. It has been speculated he was considering a mass roundup of those people, however, a mass internment never took place. Records of concentration camps show at least 20 black Germans spent time in one of these camps or in a prison, and at least one of these prisoners was euthanized. Afro-Europeans were imprisoned in camps such as Mauthausen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Dora-Mittellau.
Alright, so now I want you to imagine that you are a black American soldier, and you've been fighting on the front lines for 2 years. You're not only aching with hunger, but you haven't seen your family in so long, you miss them dearly. Desperate to leave, all of a sudden, you see a piece of paper lying on the floor, and it says, "No starving here. There's no need to go on a diet. U.S. Soldiers, come join the German side. And don't hesitate. Remember, the tiny tots want daddy back. So, in World War II, the belligerent nations dropped tons of leaflets on enemy lines to encourage opposing troops to surrender. And in their leaflets, the African American soldiers were specifically targeted by German propagandists, and they tailored their message specifically to African American soldiers, and they repeatedly played the race card, and they emphasized the overt racism in the United States. German soldiers would picture lynchings on these pamphlets too, to remind the African American soldiers of what's waiting for them back at home. And so these sorts of propaganda was used so that the African American soldiers would surrender themselves and join the German side of the fight. They especially appealed to their sense of hunger, but also their emotional senses too. And furthermore, this sort of propaganda was that light in a tunnel of darkness at the end of the tunnel, because when the African American soldiers would see this kind of thing laying around, they can't help but just wonder, what if I did surrender? Like, what might happen? Keep in mind that the African American soldiers didn't know what was occurring within these camps and what they did to prisoners of war. All they've heard were stories, and they did not believe that those were true until they saw it for their own eyes. Now keep in mind that Germany's real view on people of African descent was not one of respect. They considered black people inferior, and they used posters which depicted propaganda against black soldiers, and for one of them it says that the French Negroes raped defenseless German women and shot down German workers like dogs in the name of this civilization. Now, the German camps didn't brand prisoners of war who were black with any symbols, because their skin, the color of their skin, was now their symbol. And black prisoners of war faced illegal incarceration and mistreatment at the hand of the Nazis, and they specifically violated the international humanitarian law of the Geneva Convention, which agreed on the treatment of prisoners of war and the wounded soldiers who were captured. Now, black soldiers of the American, the French, or the British armies were either worked to death on construction projects, or they died as a result of mistreatment in these concentration camps or these prisoners of war camps. And some weren't even incarcerated. They might have just been immediately killed by the SS. And so there are many pictures of propaganda against not only just black soldiers, but also those who are considered the Rhineland bastards, which is a mix of black and white children. And so there are many people who stood up against what was happening after the unjust laws imposed. And one of the activists who was black is called Hilarius Gilligas, or Larry Gilligas. And he founded an organization called the Northwest Rand, which was a group of entertainers who fought the Nazis in his hometown. However, he was murdered at the age of 24 by the Gestapo in 1933, which is the year that Hitler came in power.
So the Schwarze Korps, which literally translates to the Black Corps, was the official newspaper of the SS officers, and it was distributed weekly every Wednesday, and it was practically made mandatory to read for all of them. It was also provided free of charge, and it was essentially created to spread the ideology of Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler. And until the end of the war, it was one of the most radical and also the only uncensored propaganda in circulation at that time. And even before the Nuremberg laws, articles in this core newspaper were released that would discourage legal leniency towards Jews, Catholics, communists, and other oppressed peoples at that time. So basically it told the judiciary that they should use their power to protect only the national state. And of course it was a form of propaganda, so they would often call out the French or write articles about Americans in there. And a main focus of their campaign was to exploit the weaknesses of the enemy, like very specifically. So one great example is that during World War I, only about, well, considering it was still a hefty amount of soldiers, but compared to World War II. So in World War I, there were about 250,000 African Americans serving in units, versus in World War II, there were over 1 million African Americans serving in the Marine, the Navy, the Army, etc. And the Nazis used this discrepancy to call out the unequal treatment that was directed towards these enlisted black soldiers, as well as calling out racial tensions in America, especially as they pertained to lynchings. And on the next slide of our presentation, on the left, you will see a propaganda cartoon that was featured in one of the Schwarze Korps newspapers. So at the top, it reads, "From the land of the lynchers," and at the bottom, there's another line that translates literally to, "It is a good thing for us Negroes that no Americans live here." And on the right, you'll see just the front page of another article, and the heading that's underlined in red and bolded translates to "That's the Standard." And it was talking about the British and their control in North Africa and India. So basically criticizing the British for how they treated the people there, kind of trying to portray them as the enemy, as the evil guy during this time as well. And it was a very, very effective method of propaganda for the SS officers.
For the Nazis, a primary target were French soldiers who were of African descent. Whenever French soldiers were captured as prisoners of war by the Germans would often weed out those of African descent either for harsher punishment or execution. Now, the Germans would often, through propaganda, they would perpetuate this idea that Afro-Europeans were animalistic and barbaric, and so they would record them dancing as they would at home and kind of promote this image that they were savages. And their newspaper would often propose rhetorical questions like, should Africans or Afro-Europeans be subjected to the mercy of prison rather than being killed? And this kind of rhetoric allowed for German soldiers to commit horrific acts against these Afro-European soldiers and prisoners of war.
So it is interesting to discuss Afro-Europeans and what laws pertained and directly targeted them in Nazi Germany. And in general, there was no overall policy that directly targeted Afro-European populations, although there was one overall objective of creating this sort of pure white racial state in Germany. And there were a lot of state-imposed definitions of who was what race and who wasn't. And the Nazis also used several charts, which will be shown later in the slide presentation. So right now, I'm just going to read out loud Article 2, Sections 1 through 3 of the Nuremberg Laws, which were titled the Reich Citizenship Laws. A Reich citizen is a subject of the state who is of German or related blood and proves by his conduct that he is fit and willing to faithfully serve the German people and Reich. Reich citizenship is acquired through the granting of a Reich citizenship certificate. The Reich citizen is the sole bearer of full political rights in accordance with the law. And in general, Afro-Europeans were never dealt with by physical elimination as other populations were. However, they were very distinguished by the hue of their skin and were not required to wear badges because of that, because people could easily identify them in most cases. Many Afro-Europeans had their passports confiscated and were declared stateless, meaning that they were not able to enter or leave the country if they chose to do so. Although they were never explicitly banned from the country. They felt oppressed in general and would have liked to leave, but they could not. And after 1937, when the war efforts really began to ramp up, Afro-Germans were employed in military-related industries or even enslaved and forced to work. And as mentioned before, the state kind of wanted to encourage Afro-Europeans to stay, although they felt very unwelcome and uncomforted. They never really directly targeted them. However, they did feel very oppressed during that time. And a lot of these sort of state-declared doctors would come up with research for the Nazi state that kind of proved their point. The literary works of Doctors Wilhelm Stuckart and Hans Kluge established state definitions for Negro and alien blood. Another one of the Nuremberg laws, it was titled The Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, and it was another Nazi racial law. Basically, it forbade marriages and sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans. It banned certain women from domestic work, as well as banning people, even with grandparents who were of Jewish or non-Aryan descent, from holding public office. And on the next slide, you'll just see on the left side is a chart outlining the racial qualifications in the Nuremberg law. So this is the chart that they used to define who was Aryan and who was not Aryan. This is the comparison that they had. And the original document was on sort of a yellower hued paper. It's just very inaccurate. You can see that they're just little circles and blobs, and it just basically tells you the percentage, percent heritage. So if going back through your ancestors, if you had a grandparent, then it has a little circle that's colored in only a fourth, and it has a word that would define what you would be in the Nazi state. And on the right side of the page, you see a Nazi racial chart used to define Mischlinge within the state.
So I'm going to be talking about the sterilization of these, quote, Rhineland bastards. And before I begin, I'm going to open up with a quote from Mein Kampf, which was written by Hitler, stating, quote, "It was and it is the Jews who bring the Negroes into the Rhineland, always with the same secret thought and clear aim of ruining the hated white race by the necessarily resulting bastardization, throwing it down from its cultural and political height, and himself rising to be its master," end quote. So I feel though this quote kind of resonates with Hitler's common theme of this preservation of the pure Aryan race, and how he believes that the mixing of genes and the mixing of races is really horrible and is just definitely something that should not be done. And you'll see this constantly being referred to as I go through with the information. So the term Rhineland bastards is a derogatory term created during Nazi Germany, and it's to describe these mixed race mulatto children, which had white German mothers and African French soldiers, and these were colonial French soldiers who occupied the Rhineland after World War I. And now I'm going to talk about one of the only black Holocaust survivors, which his name is Hans Hauck, and he was a survivor, and also sadly he was a victim of Hitler's mandatory sterilization process. And he explained his account of being sterilized in a movie called Hitler's Forgotten Victims. And he talks about how he had to undergo sterilization as a teenager. So this is a really young boy in Germany at the time, and he had to undergo this sterilization. And the part that really hits home and stuck with me is the fact that he had to undergo this invasive surgery without any anesthetic. So So you can imagine today going to the hospital to get something like a tooth pulled, and even then, your mouth is numbed. But he received absolutely no anesthetic, no medicine after being sterilized completely. And after this sterilization, he just received a simple certificate stating that he received the sterilization and saying he was, quote, free to go as long as he didn't have sexual relations with any German woman. So this shows how the Nazis viewed this just as like a normal, like mandatory regulatory program. But as for these mulatto children, this was just an unforgettable, horrendous experience that they're never going to forget. And next I'm going to be talking about this process of Germanization, which Hitler refers to again in a quote from Mein Kampf. It's a little lengthy, so I'll paraphrase. Basically, Hitler is referring to this term Germanization, which is the process of these others, meaning non-Germans, that learn the language and the culture of Germany. And he claims that this is even worse. This assimilation, like this Germanization, is worse than like any other crime that these like quote Negroes could commit, because he believes it's inconceivable to think that someone of like black ancestry, African descent, would ever be able to like become a German. And he believes that this Germanization would cause the annihilation of the true like German element. So basically, in Hitler's views, he believes that you're either born German or you're not German at all. Like, there is no in between, and assimilation is not acceptable. And even those that were black, especially these mulatto children, who grew up in Germany their entire life, they only know German culture, they only know the German language, they viewed themselves as German first and black second. And however, the Nazi party believes that they would never be Germans because they were this product of bastardization, and instead they viewed them as this obstacle in the way of the preservation of the pure German Aryan race. And these mulatto children that identified with their German heritage more than their African heritage, mostly due to the fact that their fathers were these French colonial African soldiers that had left and aren't living in Germany anymore. So they have their German mothers, and they're in Germany, so obviously they're going to relate to that culture more. Despite this, they were still arrested and charged with treason and shipped to concentration camps. And one of these survivors, Johnny Voste, was actually shipped to Dachau. He was a Belgian resistance fighter who was arrested in 1942 for alleged sabotage. There was no evidence found against him, so this was kind of just like a BS reason to send him to this concentration camp and get him out of the streets of Germany. And his job in the camp was to stack vitamin crates, and he believes that that the Germans weren't going to take his life from him, so he risked his life every day secretly shipping these vitamin crates to the detainees, like the victims in the concentration camps. And he actually saved hundreds of victims' lives because they were suffering from starvation and vitamin deficiencies, and he actually risked his life in order to save other people's lives, which I just thought was really amazing. And the last quote I found was actually from another Holocaust survivor. His name was Theodor Michael, and he was a mixed-race German sent to a concentration camp in Berlin in 1943. And while he was there, he talked about how he lived in this constant fear of being sterilized. He actually wasn't sterilized. He was able to never have to undergo that process. But he talks about how while in the camps he would be scared and afraid of running into a doctor, or every night when he went to sleep, he would think tomorrow's going to be the day, like I'm going to be sterilized, and he had heard stories about how horrendous the process was, so he lived with this constant fear every single day. And he has this quote, Because of my African appearance, it was impossible to make a single step in the then white world without being noticed every time by everyone, end quote. And I felt this kind of resonated with me because it reminded me of how the Jews at this time, they would have to wear the yellow star in order to like distinguish them from the Germans. However, with these black Afro-Germans and Afro-Europeans, they didn't have to wear these identifying marks due to the fact that the color of their skin was their identifying mark. Everywhere they went, 24/7, it was as if they were wearing like this yellow star because everyone knew they were different. They were immediately alienated and isolated due to the color of their skin. And actually, many people have asked Theodore Michael, why didn't you, theoretically try to escape these prisons? And he replied with the question, where would I have gone? And I believe that like that question, where would I have gone, is kind of a sentiment that rang true with most, if not all of these black Afro-Europeans at the time, because within Nazi occupied Germany, of course, there was resentment and there was hate towards them. But even outside of Nazi-occupied Germany, Nazi-occupied Europe, there was this resentment, this hate. They were isolated. They were alienated from everybody else. So it was kind of just showed how at this moment in time, there was no place for the black people and the Afro-Europeans, and they were constantly being persecuted.
Within the Nazi propaganda machine, Hitler attempted to depict black athletes as inferior to those of German descent. One example was with Jesse Owens, a black athlete from the USA Olympic team. Now, Hitler thought that he would be able to show that Aryans were superior to Africans or people of African descent in the Olympics, but ended up being upset by Jesse Owens, who had won 4 Olympic gold medals and set a world record for the long jump that would last 25 years after he set it. Now, funnily enough, Hitler refused to congratulate Owens, despite it being customary for the leader of the host nation for the Olympics to congratulate the gold medalist. And he was even quoted as saying, "Do you really think I would allow myself to be photographed shaking hands with a Negro?" Now, Jesse Owens was not the only Olympic athlete from the USA team to upset Germans in the Olympics. Others included John Woodruff, the USA long jump team, Mac Robinson, and Archie Williams, who all either won gold or silver and placed higher than German athletes. Now, despite Hitler failing to depict Germans and Aryans as superior to Africans during the Olympics, he was able to do so with the first fight between American boxer Joe Louis and German boxer Max Schmeling. Now, Schmeling, initially, when his fight was expected to happen, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels attempted to hide, reputation for the fight because he feared that Schmeling would lose and show the Germans and the German people that Germans were actually inferior to blacks in sports. But Schmeling ended up being on top and knocking Joe Louis out, and so after that happened, Goebbels celebrated his victory and promoted it as a German victory for the entire nation and a confirmation of their Aryan superiority bias. And Hitler even invited Schmeling to dinner and congratulated him for winning the fight and asked that the movie that depicted his victory be showed across theaters across the nation.
Now, looking at Germany today, there are still many effects of colonialism that is still present. And so there is now a group of people called the Berlin Post-Colonial who are the descendants of colored people. And in 2012, they started a program called the Street Initiative, which hopes to decolonize public space in Berlin, because there's a specific part of Berlin called the African Quarter where streets are named after founders of African colonies. For example, there's one called the Luderitzstrasse, which is named after Adolf Luderitz, the founder of Namibia. There's also Cameroon Street and Togo Street. And Germany's argument for having these street names is that it glorifies Germany's past and anchors German colonial rule in the public, and it's something that they should be proud of. However, we can obviously see why it's very offensive to those who were targets of colonialism, who are living in Berlin today. Furthermore, there's an underground railroad station that's called the Mohrenstrasse, which is a derogatory name for black people. And so at this station, it's named the M Strasse, which is equivalent to the N word that people use in English today. And so what's even more interesting is that the marble at this German station was part of Hitler's palace at the new Reich Chancellery. And so this is essentially continuing another racist line of post-colonial rule, and it's making it, it's essentially glorifying it and making it a part of Germany today, even though they've supposedly moved past this entire thing. Well, thank you. Bye.